Before we begin, you should understand one thing. If you stay until the end of this recording, you will not be able to unlearn what you're about to hear. Some patterns, once noticed, do not fade. If you want continued access to cases that were never meant to be revisited, observations erased, files sealed, testimonies quietly rewritten, subscribe now. This archive only remains open as long as someone is listening. The children were not patients. That distinction matters. They were classified as subjects, which implied distance, control, and the assumption that observation would remain one-directional. The facility was designed with that assumption embedded into its walls. One-way glass, directional microphones, behavioral logging software calibrated to record motion, vocalization, eye tracking. Every system built on the premise that whatever occurred inside the observation rooms would never acknowledge the presence of those watching. For the first 6 weeks, the data behaved. The children sat where they were told. They played with the provided objects. They spoke when prompted, fell silent when not. Their eye movements followed predictable developmental curves, aligning with age, stimulus, and environmental stress. The research team noted mild anomalies, heightened pattern recognition, unusual memory recall, but nothing outside acceptable deviation thresholds. That is why the early footage feels so calm when reviewed now. You can see it in their posture. Relaxed shoulders, idle hands, glances that drift but never fixate. When they look toward the observation glass, their eyes pass over it without registering depth, as if the barrier truly did not exist. That was the last time the glass functioned as intended. The first irregularity was dismissed as coincidence. Subject CO4 paused mid-task during a standard cognitive assessment. No external stimulus had changed. No audio cue, no shift in lighting. Yet the child stopped, tilted their head slightly, and stared directly into the glass for nearly 12 seconds. The software logged it as an outlier, a random fixation, and the test continued. What the software did not record was the reaction in the observation room. 3 researchers later described the same sensation independently. A brief but intense feeling of being acknowledged, not seen in a metaphorical sense, but noticed as if attention itself had weight. And for a moment, it had pressed outward through the barrier. The report uses careful language. Perceived discomfort, projection bias, observer interference. None of those phrases explain why the room fell silent. By the end of that week, the behavior repeated, then again, then spread. The children began looking toward the glass more often, not constantly, not erratically, but deliberately. Their gazes lingered just long enough to be unmistakable, then returned to their activities as if nothing had occurred. No verbalization, no visible emotion, just a quiet confirmation that something on the other side had registered. The research team adjusted protocols. Observation periods were shortened. Lighting was modified to reduce reflective artifacts. The glass was tested for microfractures, optical distortion, anything that could create the illusion of transparency. All tests came back negative. The barrier remained intact. The children remained physically contained. Still, the feeling persisted. You can hear it in the archived audio, subtle changes in breathing among the observers, longer pauses before annotations, the faint rustle of someone shifting position without realizing why. The more time passed, the more the researchers avoided standing directly in front of the glass. They began watching from the corners of the room instead. That was when the children started tracking movement. Not randomly, not as a group. Individually, each child responded to different observers. When someone entered the observation room late, one child would lift their head before the door closed. When someone leaned forward to whisper, another child's eyes would adjust slightly, as if compensating for a change in distance. The logs insist this was impossible. The children had no auditory access, no visual line of sight. The glass was treated, layered, certified, and yet the timestamps aligned too cleanly to ignore. Every motion on one side of the barrier corresponded to a reaction on the other, delayed by fractions of a second too small to attribute to chance. At this point, the research focus shifted. The original objectives, language acquisition, pattern learning, adaptive cognition, were quietly deprioritized. New metrics appeared in the reports: reciprocal attention, observer response latency, bidirectional awareness potential. The phrasing remained academic, but the tone had changed. They were no longer studying what the children could perceive. They were studying what the children understood. During a closed session review, one researcher raised a concern that never made it into the official minutes. He suggested that the children were not responding to stimuli, but to intention. That they were not looking through the glass, but at the act of being watched itself. The room went quiet again. 2 days later, Subject C11 spoke directly to the glass. There was no prompt, no instruction. The child stopped drawing, placed the pencil down carefully, and stood. Their face remained neutral, their posture relaxed. Then they said a single sentence, clearly, calmly, and without emotion. The audio recording captures it perfectly. You can stand closer if you want. No one moved. The observation team froze, each person acutely aware of their own breathing, their own heartbeat, the exact position of their body in the room. The sentence was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was offered the way one might offer a chair. When no one responded, the child sat back down and resumed drawing. The official explanation cites echolalia, pattern mimicry, a statistical coincidence derived from overheard language during transport. But if that were true, it does not explain why the microphones recorded no such phrase anywhere in the facility. It also does not explain why, from that moment forward, the children stopped reacting to cameras entirely. They no longer looked at lenses. They no longer responded to motion sensors or environmental cues. Their attention narrowed, refined, until it focused on only one thing: the people watching them. And that is where the footage from Part 2 begins to change. After the first direct address, the facility entered what internal documents later described as a heightened observation phase. In practice, this meant longer hours, tighter access control, and an unspoken agreement among the staff to stop discussing what they were feeling and focus only on what could be measured. That decision did not slow the change. It accelerated it. The children stopped behaving like subjects under observation and began behaving like participants in a shared environment. Their movements grew more economical, less exploratory. Play became structured, almost rehearsed. When one child stood, another followed moments later, without looking. When one sat, the others adjusted their posture, as if responding to an unspoken cue. From the outside, it resembled coordination. From inside the observation room, it felt closer to anticipation. You would notice it first in the way they positioned themselves. Always with at least one child facing the glass directly. Not staring, not glaring, just present, available. The others arranged themselves around that focal point, forming loose shapes that shifted slowly over time, like a living diagram only visible if you stopped trying to interpret it. The software flagged nothing abnormal. The patterns were too subtle, too fluid, slipping neatly between thresholds designed to catch abrupt changes. Every time an analyst attempted to isolate a behavior, it dissolved back into something statistically acceptable. The unease came from what the data did not show. Observers reported a growing difficulty maintaining eye contact with the children, not because the children were threatening, but because the gaze felt returned in a way that disrupted the usual hierarchy. Looking became an exchange rather than an act of control. Some staff began taking notes without lifting their eyes at all. Others leaned closer to the glass, despite instructions not to. You might think this was curiosity. It wasn't. It was something closer to correction, as if proximity itself was being adjusted unconsciously, drawn toward an equilibrium the room demanded. During one overnight session, a junior analyst attempted to test a hypothesis. He entered the observation room alone, stood deliberately in a blind spot behind the glass, and waited. According to protocol, the children should not have responded. They did. Subject CO for shifted position within seconds, rotating their bodies slightly so their line of sight aligned precisely with where the analyst stood, despite no visual access. Subject CO7 mirrored the movement moments later. The remaining children adjusted their spacing, forming a loose arc that faced not the glass, but the analyst's unseen position behind it. The analyst stepped away. The children relaxed. That footage was reviewed only once before being sealed. No one present disputed what they saw. They disputed what it meant. In the days that followed, the children began anticipating questions. During assessments, they answered before prompts were delivered. They corrected phrasing. They waited patiently when an observer hesitated, as if aware of internal deliberation on the other side of the glass. It became impossible to tell who was leading the interaction. You would expect escalation at this point: lockdowns, external review, termination of the study. Instead, the facility doubled down on containment through routine. Sessions continued. Meals were delivered. Logs were filed. The structure held, even as its purpose eroded. The first explicit reversal occurred during a standard language evaluation. An observer, fatigued and distracted, read a question incorrectly. Before he could correct himself, Subject C11 smiled, not broadly, not mockingly, and spoke softly. "That's not what you meant to ask." The room went still. The child then repeated the correct question, word for word, using the observer's own cadence. Audio analysis later confirmed that the child's vocal pattern matched the observer's speech rhythms more closely than the child's baseline. It was not mimicry in the conventional sense. It was sync. After that session, the children stopped initiating speech, unless spoken to directly. But when they did respond, their answers carried a weight that felt disproportionate to their age. Not in content, but in delivery. Pauses fell exactly where discomfort peaked. Eye contact lingered until it forced the observer to look away first. Several staff members requested reassignment. Their reasons varied on paper: stress, family obligations, unrelated health issues, but their exit interviews shared a common undercurrent. Each described the same sensation. That time in the observation room felt asymmetrical. That minutes inside stretched, while hours outside collapsed. One analyst described dreaming in transcripts. Another began hearing the children's voices while reviewing unrelated footage, though no audio was present. The children, meanwhile, remained calm. Their heart rate stabilized. Stress indicators dropped. Sleep patterns normalized. Whatever anxiety existed in the room belonged exclusively to the adults. The most troubling shift occurred quietly. The children stopped reacting when observers entered or left the room. Not because they could no longer sense it, but because they no longer needed to. Their attention had become continuous, unbroken by physical presence. They did not watch entrances. They did not track movement. They simply knew. At some point, the question stopped being whether the children were aware of observation. The question became whether observation was still happening at all. And that realization set the stage for the first incident the reports would later classify as irreversible. The incident was never labeled as a breach. That word implies a failure of barriers, a moment where containment gives way to intrusion. What occurred did not involve force, damage, or violation of physical boundaries. Every lock remained engaged. Every protocol was followed. Every system continued to operate within expected parameters. And yet something had crossed. It began with a procedural adjustment that seemed harmless at the time. In response to mounting staff fatigue and the growing psychological strain of prolonged observation, the facility authorized a limited reduction in live monitoring. Observation sessions would continue, but analysts were encouraged to rely more heavily on automated systems. Cameras, biometric sensors, behavioral algorithms. Human presence would be minimized. The children were informed of none of this. The first automated session recorded no anomalies. The second showed slight deviations in posture and movement, but nothing actionable. It was during the third that the software flagged a condition it had no category for: a sustained absence of variance. The children remained active. They moved, spoke, interacted with their environment, but the micro-fluctuations that defined natural behavior had flattened. Heart rates synchronized within narrow margins. Eye movement slowed. Gestures became deliberate, as if executed against an internal clock no one else could see. It looked like calm. It felt like waiting. When the analysts returned to the observation room the following morning, the children were already standing. All of them, facing the glass. Not clustered. Not arranged. Simply aligned, each occupying a position that placed them equidistant from one another. They did not speak. They did not move. They waited. No protocol addressed this configuration. The staff stood frozen behind the glass, acutely aware of their own reflections overlaying the children's faces. For a brief moment, the distinction between observer and subject dissolved entirely. Everyone in the room became aware of being seen, not physically, but attentively. A senior researcher broke the silence. "Please, sit down." The children complied immediately. The relief that followed was disproportionate, almost embarrassing. Nervous laughter surfaced and was quickly suppressed. Notes were taken, explanations drafted. The system, it was decided, would be recalibrated. That afternoon, the logs recorded the first anomaly that could not be dismissed. During a routine cognitive task, subject CO7 stopped responding. The child remained seated, eyes fixed on a point just to the right of the glass. Not at a person, not at a camera, at a space that should have been empty. Biometric readings remained stable. No signs of distress, no elevated stress markers. The child simply waited. One by one, the other children followed. Within minutes, every subject in the room had oriented toward the same unseen point. The software registered nothing unusual. The cameras captured nothing out of place. Only the human observers felt the shift, the subtle pressure of attention converging somewhere just beyond their own position. Someone whispered that they felt cold. Someone else said the room felt smaller. The moment passed without escalation. The children resumed activity. The incident was logged as inconclusive. That night, the automated systems recorded something they could not display. Presence indicators fluctuated without corresponding biometric data. The system registered occupancy in spaces that contained no bodies. Not just the observation room, but adjacent corridors, storage areas, control rooms. Always briefly, always transient, always resolving before triggering alarms. By morning, the logs showed normalcy restored. It was the consistency of the errors that unsettled the engineering team. The same pattern, repeating across subsystems, never designed to communicate. Independent redundancies all reporting the same impossibility. Someone was present where no one should be. The children were calm the next day. More than calm, content. Their interactions grew gentle, almost considerate. They took turns speaking. They waited for one another. When corrected, they adjusted without resistance. The atmosphere inside the observation room felt orderly in a way that bordered on ritual. An analyst noted, quietly, that it felt like the children were hosting something. That remark never made it into any report. The first direct confrontation occurred during a closed session with subject C11. The child was asked a simple question, one that had been asked dozens of times before. Instead of answering, the child looked directly at the glass and asked one in return, "Why do you still pretend you're alone in there?" No one responded. The child nodded, as if confirming a hypothesis. That evening, one of the analysts stayed late to review footage. Alone in the control room, lights dimmed, monitors humming softly. As he rewound and replayed the recordings, he noticed something he had missed before. A pattern not in the children's behavior, but in the room itself. Moments where the lighting shifted imperceptibly, where shadows thickened, where reflections in the glass did not quite match the geometry of the space. He leaned closer to the screen. In one frame, barely visible, a reflection appeared behind the children. Not a shape, not a figure, just a distortion, as if the air itself had learned how to occupy space. The analyst stopped the playback. The reflection did not disappear. It remained on the screen, frozen, despite no corresponding object in the room. When he finally looked away from the monitor, the control room felt wrong. Not empty, not occupied, aware. The incident was reported the next morning. By then, it no longer mattered, because whatever had been watching from behind the glass was no longer confined to staying there. The facility was never officially evacuated. That fact alone unsettles those who later discover the archive. There is no directive ordering a shutdown, no emergency protocol triggered, no incident report documenting a breach that justified abandonment. The lights were turned off systematically. The systems were powered down in sequence. Personal effects were left behind, but not in panic. Everything suggests an exit planned calmly by people who understood there was no longer a role for them inside. The children were the last to be logged as present. On the final day of monitoring, the observation room remained empty. No analysts stood behind the glass. No engineers watched the feeds. The cameras continued to run, capturing hours of footage without witnesses. The children sat quietly in the center of the room, facing outward, no longer toward the glass but toward the space where observers had once been. They did not attempt to leave. They did not test boundaries. They did not speak. At exactly 14:32, every biometric sensor flatlined simultaneously, not spiking, not failing, simply ceasing to report. The system registered no distress, no loss of life, no movement. The children remained visible on camera, breathing, blinking, adjusting posture, alive by every visible measure, absent by every system designed to confirm it. Moments later, the presence indicators changed. Where the room once registered 6 occupants, it now registered 7. The additional presence did not correspond to mass, heat, motion, or any known biological marker. It did not move independently. It did not interact directly. It simply existed in the room with the children, occupying space without manifesting form. The cameras began to fail shortly after. Not all at once, one feed at a time. Each camera showed a subtle distortion before cutting to static. The final operational feed lingered longer than the others, capturing a still image that would later be extracted frame by frame. In that image, the children are standing again, calm, aligned, their attention directed not outward, but inward toward the center of the room, where nothing should be. One child is smiling. The facility logs end there. Years later, when the site was rediscovered during a routine audit of decommissioned properties, Investigators found no signs of decay consistent with abandonment. Dust lay evenly. Doors were sealed. The observation room was intact, the glass unbroken. There were no children, no bodies, no traces of struggle. The only anomaly was the presence counter, still powered by an independent backup system, glowing faintly in the dark. It read 7. Attempts to reset the system failed. Attempts to replace it resulted in the same reading. Even when disconnected entirely, the number persisted, burned faintly into the display as if the hardware itself had accepted it as fact. The site was sealed again. The final report concludes that the study failed due to observer contamination, and recommends that future research avoid prolonged exposure to reciprocal awareness scenarios. The language is clinical, the tone detached, but an addendum, written by an unknown author and appended without authorization, offers a different conclusion. It suggests that the children were never the anomaly, that they were simply more receptive. That observation is not a passive act, and attention is not one-directional. Though to watch something closely enough is to invite response, whether or not you believe you deserve one. The addendum ends with a single sentence. They did not learn we were watching them. They learned that we could not stop. If you are listening to this now, understand that the archive did not reopen by accident. These records persist because awareness leaves residue, because attention creates continuity, because once something learns how to look back, it does not forget where it was seen from. And somewhere, in a room with no observers and no glass, the count has never returned to 0.